And I grew up in this very heavy ag community, and nobody in the conservation space like that. And I was working. So also through college, the best thing I could do was work on farms, and I work construction, right? That was the best money I could make to go do other things. So worked as a welder, went and worked on farms in the summer, did that kind of stuff to put myself through college. But almost every person that I talked to, family or otherwise, thought I was going to go become some environmentalist, like that I wanted to destroy farming or development, because even in the construction side, right? Because we're taking habitat away or those kind of things. So I got hit with that pretty early on, and also growing up with some family members that were almost on the anti-hunting side or didn't understand it, or friends or people you went to college with, or you go to a big university. You're going to run into people from all over the world that didn't understand that. And so, and I know a lot of us are doing it, but you share the game meat with them, or you give them something other than what they would buy at the grocery store, and they get that appreciation for it because they maybe, and I'm talking international, people from other countries that are coming to a big university that really don't get it, especially when they're roommates with a farm hick like me that,
I don't know about you, but I always carry a knife. It doesn't matter what the situation is, I'm always reaching for a blade. Whether I'm out hunting in the backwoods, fishing on lakes and rivers, or simply cutting rope at camp. And when I need a tool, I want something that's quality, durable, and handmade right here in the USA. I know that's something you're looking for as well, so go to maloneknives.com and get yourself something that's going to last and look damn good too. I'm a huge fanatic for handmade, high-quality leather and canvas products. In my opinion, they last longer, hold up better to the abuses of travel, and honestly, they just look really cool. That's why I use Badger Claw Outfitters. They've been making handcrafted products for hunting, camping, and travel since 2011, and that's right up my alley. Best part is they're made right here in the USA and are guaranteed for life. They've got everything from gun leather, belts, custom knife sheaths, wallets, duffel bags, leather and canvas pouches, everyday carry items, and more. Badger Claw Outfitters, made in the USA, built for the wild. This is the Aptitude Outdoors podcast, where we interview conservationists, hunters, anglers, and outdoorsmen and women to bring you the greatest stories, information, and advice from the best in the world. All right, everybody, welcome back to the Aptitude Outdoors podcast. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, our special guest is Jim Inglis. He's the Director of Governmental Affairs for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, and we dive down into the weeds of conservation policy and what it's like to work at that level, working with the government on policy and things of that nature. We also get very philosophical on what hunting means to us personally, and I had a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it as well. So let's dive right into it. So you've been doing some form of conservation work for quite a few years now, and me as a newer hunter, that's kind of like where it leads to at the end of the day is like you start getting into hunting, you start getting into fishing, you start doing more consumptive activities, and then at the end of the day it's like, well, I start noticing things like, hey, there's not really that much public land around me up here in Northwest Ohio. I mean, there's it's crowded. There's not that much for the amount of people out here. And then you start like, well, why is that? And you start down this rabbit hole of conservation. That's where you ultimately end up, I feel like, as a hunter and angler. So where did that start for you?
Oh man, we're gonna go way back. So, I was fortunate enough to grow up on a dairy farm in Western New York State. That's where I would say at a very early age, I loved to explore our woods and our fields, and just really had that interest. And quite honestly, though, I didn't grow up in a hunting family. There are a lot of farmers, especially dairy farmers and livestock folks, have got a lot of things going on during the day. And so like my father and my grandfather on my dad's side didn't hunt. Mm-hmm. But I grew up, man, wanting to do it. Like as soon as I had a slingshot, I'm shooting pigeons and blackbirds and starlings and those kind of things. But my mom was somewhat of a naturalist. And so she would let me only shoot the invasive species. I couldn't shoot the good songbirds and those kind of things. But I can just tell you, I felt like I was really born with it. And then, having the farmland and those kind of things, and then meeting friends in school, by the time you hit junior high and you start meeting your hunting buddies, or, I was lucky enough to have the farm, and I had some of my buddies that didn't have access to land. So we kind of learned together, or, their fathers had, the dogs or the decoys. And that's kind of how I really got into it. And then beyond that, it was like, and also during that time as I graduated high school, and we actually stopped farming. And I always kind of had this thing about, do you become a conservation officer? How do you get into natural resources or forestry? Mm-hmm. And being in Western New York, 30 some years ago, it was forestry or wildlife officer kind of thing. So I took that into education, and I decided to go that path. And that's how I kind of ended up with that deal, and finding that I could make a career out of it. And now I find myself doing conservation and especially farm bill policy, kind of tying in those ag roots and going that direction. So that's just kind of a quick snapshot of how I got into conservation and made a career of it. And I've been with Pheasants, Forever, and Quail forever for 22 years. Started out as a regional biologist here in Ohio after coming out of grad school. But for the last 10 years, I've spent my time mostly on conservation policy, or all of it on conservation policy, whether it's state level policy and advocacy, or, I'm in and out of DC quite often. We've got a team in DC, but I've traveled the last 10 years, several times a year to do that. So that's a little bit of a snapshot for you.
Great. Yeah. And that's an awesome path. I remember specifically when I was in high school, they give you those like tests, and they ask you what you want to be when you graduate, and they kind of like try and send you down this path. And I remember writing down that I wanted to be a naturalist, and nobody knew what that was. And they were like, I was like, no, this is like a real job. Like if you go to the parks, there's naturalists there. And they're like, yeah, I don't think so. So I never had any foundation. If I would have had that job, I'd probably be in a very different situation right now than what I am. But like, obviously the interest hasn't gone away, because I'm here doing this podcast right now, decade and a half later. So for people who don't know, like what is Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever? Because I don't think most people know that they're kind of work together. And then like B, I don't think pheasant hunting isn't as popular where I'm at right now, just because I don't think we have quite the habitat here in Northwest Ohio for it like we used to. So what's a general overview for the people who aren't aware of what these organizations are?
Okay. Well, what's really cool is we're headed into our 40th year. That celebration is going to happen next month at our annual convention and conference. But Pheasants Forever was started in 1982 by a couple gentlemen that were really concerned about the decline in pheasant hunting. And it was a gentleman by the name of Jeff Finden, who worked for the St. Paul Pioneer Press. He was kind of an advertising guy, and an outdoor writer, Dennis Anderson, who was an outdoor writer for the in that area. And these two guys basically just started the organization in their basement. 1982. They knew that we needed something, back there in the late 70s, early 80s, lots of bad winters. Populations were crashing, habitat was leaving the landscape. And so those two gentlemen started it there. Fast forward to today. So also in between there, because you mentioned Quail Forever as well. So we started out and did that. Like I said, I started about 22 years ago here in Ohio. And to be clear, I am in Northwest Ohio. I've spent my entire career here, Wyandotte County, actually, Upper Sandusky. And so we, the first chapters in Ohio, say, started in 1988 or whatever. So it really started to spread. And one of the things that was kind of unique about the Pheasants Forever model was if you raise your money locally, it's the decision to spend it stays local. That's so if you go out and make $5,000, you can take that $5,000 and put it into your local county or your community with some sideboards. I mean, there's certain things that that you're not allowed to spend money on, but habitat, youth education, R3 recruitment, that kind of deal. So that's just an example of what we were able to do. So fast forward to around 2005, and there wasn't really a strong quail organization in the country. And so actually, I was fortunate enough, I was part of the team to help launch Quail Forever in 2005. So it's a sister organization to PF. It's still underneath the Pheasants Forever umbrella or Pheasants Forever Inc. But Quail Forever is kind of a division or, an organization along with that. Same model. So that, opened us up in the quail range, especially the southeast, because when you looked at where Pheasants Forever footprint was, it was in the pheasant counties throughout the country, from New York to California and North Dakota to Panhandle of Texas. So we had some coverage, but the southeast was obviously a pretty open spot. So again, fast forward to today, we now have about 750 of these county and community-based chapters. We're going to hit $100 million in mission this year. So that's a big, headed into our 40th year anniversary. We're putting $100 million a year on the ground. We've got, over 400 employees. Some of those are at that very local level, working in the county and communities, putting habitat in the ground or working with farmers and ranchers and landowners. We're doing public land stuff, private land stuff, kind of the gamut. So again, that's a little bit of a snapshot of who we are as an organization. And we've held true to that model that Jeff and Dennis set forth, and you raise your money. So now if you got a chapter that raises $100,000 at their local fundraiser, or they do raffles or do whatever, they can help put that money into their local community and their state, in their region to do great things for habitat and youth education and outdoors.
So I specifically remember when I was younger, my dad talking about right here. I mean, he lived in like the Toledo area his whole life. We moved up to southern Michigan, which is only a half hour away. And that's where I grew up. And now I'm back here in Northwest Ohio. And I remember him talking about pheasant hunting. He had like the upland vest. He had all the gear. He had all the shotguns and stuff. He's got pictures of like him and his buddies pheasant hunting. This was probably in the 70s or even before that. I'm not quite 100% sure. But now it's like, I don't know anybody that pheasant hunts here in Northwest Ohio. And what's the reasoning for that? Is it lost popularity in this region, or is there just less habitat for it because of expanding, farmlands and urban sprawl? Why don't I hear about that in Northwest Ohio specifically anymore compared to decades ago?
Sure. Well, it all comes back to habitat, and I can even tell you, being in New York and growing up on our farm, we still had wild birds, on our land and in that part of the state. And unfortunately, throughout the range, the things that you identified, loss of habitat is number one. If you don't have 15 to 20% of a landscape in grassland cover, undisturbed nesting cover, your populations will start to blink out in that region. Unfortunately, that's happened in Northwest Ohio. It's happened here in my county here in Wyandotte. There are still some spots where you hit that threshold, and there's still a stronghold of wild birds in the very northwest corner, southern Michigan, as you mentioned too, where we have some of that grassland habitat, Lake Erie watershed, but especially in Ohio down through the Scioto River watershed. So Marion kind of south down through there, where we have a lot of conservation cover, really through the Farm Bill programs. And I know we'll get through the policy and conservation funding in a little bit, but it's really part of that. But we know, and we've got a pretty good handle on it. The really cool thing is pheasant research in Ohio started by, Ohio State University back in the 30s. Like some of the really start of wildlife management, as a profession, a lot of it started there. And they've got some really documented research over the decades. Mail. So one of the counts that they did is the rural mail carrier. So the indices, Iowa is another great state for that, but Ohio had a lot of that information. But again, it's coming back. As you mentioned, we also have a lot of people. We have that interface of very productive and intense farming operations, which we need, but we also have a lot of people, and we have a lot of sprawl and losing that habitat. So it's that edge piece, or that space where it's kind of a struggle for grassland wildlife like pheasant to thrive in.
Yeah. And the thing that's interesting to me most about pheasant, I've never hunted pheasant. I've hunted a lot of other things, but I've never hunted pheasant, is like, they're not a native bird to the US, but like nobody seems to have an issue with it like they do with other birds. Why? Like, I've just been trying to wrap my head around why that is, because we get any other non-native bird and they're like, get out of here. And then pheasants, everyone's like, yeah, this is great. So, I mean, it's not like as if it's raising conservation dollars, I really don't care. I think that's amazing. So why is that they're like just so accepted, whereas like other birds floating around, they're just like people just get irate about them?
Well, you're absolutely right. It was an introduced species. I believe they were introduced into, I think it was Mercer County in like 1890s, probably in Ohio. It really was like that 1870s, 1880s out in Oregon. Is where they first took, but they were trying to introduce them. And of course, what we did as people, and no matter where we came to the United States and the world, we thought we should bring our species and whether plant, animal, fish, and kind of wreaked havoc with the system. What I will say is that we're doing our best to eradicate the pheasant population every fall. So we're doing our part to try to do that. But what we would say in the biologist world is that, it is a naturalized species. It's been here for over 100 years. It really doesn't compete with many other species other than potentially in the West with prairie chickens. There can be a little bit of competition there, but really they are naturalized. But you can look at some of the upland birds, other upland birds like chukars or Hungarian partridge, same deal, where they've been released or other there. So that's the reason behind it. It is here. It kind of fills a niche that other species don't. And we haven't talked about quail much either, but we also still have a quail population in southern Ohio, I'm going to miss the counties, but where we can still have huntable populations. But again, both species that are struggling because of lack of habitat on the landscape. And they're also a pretty good indication that we're going to have other species, non or migratory birds or other mostly migratory birds that are also struggling because of that lack of habitat. And it really comes to that undisturbed grassland that's on the ground, undisturbed during the nesting season. So, it's not being farmed or hayed or heavily grazed during that nesting period, although some of those activities are still okay if we can have that 15 to 20% across the landscape in a given year. Winter cover can be minor. A lot of people talk about the blizzards, maybe that your dad saw in the late 70s or the blizzards there. But if you look at the populations of quail and pheasant during that time, they were on a long-term steady decline since probably the 50s, 60s, because of that loss of habitat. So there's your invasive introduced species question for you, or answer.
Yeah. And the thing with quail is like, I read the Ohio Hunting Handbook every year. It comes out because they change the rules and laws quite often, over the course of the years. And I always see stuff about quail. I'm like, where can I hunt quail here in Ohio? Because when I think of quail, I think south, I think far south, like even like Texas and stuff. And, I've been to a conference where I heard Dr. Dale Rollins speak, and he's out there. And I learned a lot about like bobwhite quail down in Texas and stuff. And like it shocked me that we had them here in Ohio. So like, where is their like natural range of quail in the United States? Like obviously it starts way up here in, I would assume, southern Ohio, but like, where's their natural range?
Well, so they historically probably were definitely into southern Michigan. And even even that corner of Northwest Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, I believe there's still some that pop up there occasionally with quail. I know, talking with the folks around here that were big hunters, they were still shooting wild quail in Wyandotte County in the 70s. Again, it was that loss of habitat and that change. The other thing is, and like I mentioned, we mentioned this blizzard of 78, that really hit a good part of the country. But you can look at the data from Ohio and other states where it's really, they didn't have a chance to rebound. So it hit them so hard, but then there wasn't the habitat there. They we call it blinking out, like an endangered species, or you can see where those populations shrink. And then sometimes, you even get into a genetic bottleneck where you have the satellite population that's trying to hold on, but then, or if they get hit with a bad weathered event or disease, they just can't rebound. And that's what we see in a lot of species, not just birds, but, big game too, where that could potentially happen. So those are the things that we try to mitigate by having larger populations or connected populations through corridors. Like I said, there's a wild population of pheasants in, maybe Marion County south, and we've got this northwest corner, but anywhere in between, there's likely not a wild bird, just because those populations in the last 30 years have blinked out. So that's what we try to mitigate from the quail side. The other thing about quail is that they don't like to they don't move very far. So they're not a bird. Pheasants will generally fly longer distances, or, through all the research. And I've done some like radio telemetry research on, my experience been with pheasants and then wild turkeys in South Mississippi. But, now we can put GPS collars almost on anything.
Yep.
And then track them on a daily basis and see their movements. But quail don't like to move far, and they need those corridors of brushy habitat to stay away from predators and move through the landscape through a hedgerow or blocks of that cover, that overhead cover, so that they can survive and move in a direction they need to. So they don't disperse well.
Does the historical expansion of coyotes have any effect on those populations too? Because I know that's a huge topic too that people always are going on about, is coyote and coyote control. And they're a tricky species in and of themselves just because of how they reproduce. But I would assume they would prey on these animals, especially if they're nesting on the ground.
Correct. In most wildlife populations in any species, predation is usually a very limiting factor to the health of the population. It's really that habitat first. And think of states like, say, Texas or South Dakota. There are a bunch of coyotes and predators in that landscape.
Yep.
There's just a lot more cover. But what can happen, like I talked about how these populations can shrink in on themselves, or if they're smaller blocks, it's more efficient. So it's more efficient for a coyote to hunt a 15-acre field than it is a 150-acre field. Mm-hmm. And you can also see that. And again, research has been done here in Ohio and Iowa and South Dakota and Florida and Texas. All of this upland bird research. And I kind of pride myself as starting out as an upland bird biologist or a game bird biologist over anything else. But when you look at that information, then it's really that habitat and trapping and trying to remove those from the population can be helpful. But also the things with quail and ground nesting birds, more predators would be your small mammals or foxes, and coyotes can actually limit those populations. So they can help keep foxes out of there. They'll kill foxes, raccoons, possums, skunks. When you look at the impact on a ground nesting bird like a pheasant or quail.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up. I was just talking to somebody the other day. One of my friends is like a very good wildlife photographer and videographer, and she had posted a thing online about she got a video of this coyote, and I was like, you know what? I've very, very rarely seen coyotes here where I live because they're just so slinky and they sneak around. And I was driving home the other night. It was like 10 o'clock, and I see this coyote run across the road. And a few days before, I'm sitting in a deer stand, and I see a fox just running through this little valley. I was in southern Ohio. I was like, this is great. I love this so much. Just a side note. So let's start diving into the weeds here about the work that you do and like what conservation really is on a political level. And that's kind of the thing that I've been noticing lately is you think about conservation and, if you're hunting in any sort of like capacity, like if you're serious into hunting and you really are into getting into the conservation side of things, you're a part of some sort of organization generally, whether it be Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, Ducks Unlimited, all of these kind of organizations. And the thing that I've started to learn is talking to people like you is that it's a very politically involved process when you get to like what these organizations do. And it's mostly, from what I've seen, is wildlife habitat or, going up to the state's DNR or whatever and working with them on wildlife policy and stuff. So could you just give an example of how involved politically you are on your end with like the work that you do in your job? What's it look like for you? Like, what's your day in, day out policy making stuff look like, or shaping stuff look like?
Sure. well, let's go back for a while and kind of frame it up that when you look at conservation policy and what we know is kind of the North American model of conservation, right? Or we go back to even when, a couple hundred years on people recognizing that we had this resource and there were people that recognized that we better protect it because it wasn't unlimited.
Yes.
Like we caused, severe declines in species through market hunting and those kind of things. So I think you almost have to go back to Teddy Roosevelt or go back. I think the first game law ever introduced, I want to say it was Vermont in the 1780s, about recognizing that there needed to be game laws because we were having an impact. And so there was like a local municipality or state that did that. And so when we get up through that time, and especially the late 1800s, early 1900s, the bird feather trade and putting regulations in there, wood ducks were almost could have gone extinct, the bison, all of those things where people really took notice of that and made a difference. And it became part of policy and protecting that. And those people cared about it enough. So we just have such a rich history of that that's so unique worldwide. And it's just really awesome to be engaged in that and part of that. So it is part of our legislation, whether it be state or federal, where it shows up. And when we go back to the Pittman-Robertson, we start out with kind of those migratory bird protections and protecting waterfowl and migratory birds. And then we get into the 30s and the duck stamp and Pittman-Robertson, all of those things that really happened during that movement. Some of that language that was written up there has been amended and continues through today. And we just try to make it better or make the change for the times. Maybe it is a little bit different than what it was 100 years ago. So we got to change it up a little bit, or even 5 or 10 years. So all of our organizations, like you mentioned some of them already, and a lot of colleagues that I work with day by day to find one, a lot of those things need to be reauthorized. Some of those aren't permanent funding or permanent programs. They need to be reauthorized every few years. Some of them are permanent, like say the Pittman-Robertson Act, that was back in the 30s and in 1937. But we just went through a Pittman-Robertson Remodernization Act just a couple years ago to make it a little bit more flexible for state agencies to do things with, R3, retention, recruitment, reactivation of hunters. And also using maybe some of those funds for recreational shooting operations and being able to have that, because it is part of it, right? So that money, any of the sales there, that's just an example of updating that and working with the partnerships with our organizations as well as with members of Congress and their staff to get it right, so that it can continue for, hundreds of years in the future. So that's kind of what I think of that way, to make sure that it's a tool that we can still use. So, you mentioned what happens day to day. It depends. You wake up, there's bills that are there's thousands of bills introduced every year in Congress. There's hundreds of bills introduced on each state. So you have your state advocacy and you kind of federal and state legislators and administrations that you have to work with. And so collectively as a community, wildlife conservation, hunting, angling community, we're just engaged in those things to make sure that we're supporting the legislation and programs that are beneficial and, really taking a stand on those that could be harmful. And we work on those things on a daily basis. And that's kind of what happens. Federally, they move a little bit slower, but some of those states can move really quickly. They introduce and drop a bill in committee on Thursday and have a hearing on Monday. So you're working through the weekend to try to figure out, are we going to testify for this? Are we going to push against it? I would say we all have our kind of policy platforms that we work on and our priorities. And so, again, that's just an example of the things we do on a day-to-day basis. Some things are a little bit more of a slow burn. Other ones you got to move really quickly. And that's when you see those action items show up on social media or emails or, on the news that we need to engage in this quickly.
Yeah. And I think that that's really important for people to know, that it's just not this like static thing where just money gets moved around for habitat. It's a lot more involved, and like it's people like you that are really like like guard dogs, making sure that stuff like doesn't get completely screwed. Because like you think about it, for every hunter out there that's passionate about hunting and fishing and whatever, there's also a person who's just as passionate on the other side saying, I don't want you to do this. Like hunting isn't necessarily a God-given right. It's something that we all have to collectively agree that's like, yes, this is something that is allowed to do legally here in the United States, because there are countries that don't allow it at all, or there's like very, very, very insanely tight regulations. And, I think I also want to give people the idea of like just how good they have it here. I mean, you can pretty much hunt year round for something somewhere in the United States. And that's like a huge thing that we should be happy for, as hunters and fishermen. And, I really appreciate the work that people like you are doing to keep the average guy like me who doesn't know much about policy and stuff to be able to do this for a long time. So One thing that I've also learned, which you're very involved with, is how intertwined the Farm Bill is with like wildlife and habitat conservation. It's definitely not something people think about as farm, hunting, wildlife conservation, and this big thing where it all comes together. So how does, you work specifically a lot with the Farm Bill, so how does that impact conservation, wildlife conservation, all the stuff that, you know, we deal with here as hunters and fishermen?
Well, now we're getting into my the center of my wheelhouse.
Yes.
And again, mention the farm background and having that passion too. But so the Farm Bill, and again, talking historically, we go back to some of the first conservation legislation that ever happened, and we got to go back to the 1930s. I mean, think Dust Bowl. And when you had folks in D.C. that they kind of held off an Ag Committee hearing to wait for the dust storm from the Midwest to hit Washington, D.C. about the time that there was testimony happening to say, hey, we got an issue here. We need to do that. So when you look at that time period and what we needed to do from soil conservation, that's the start of it. And again, kind of that start of that, you know, whether you call it the environmental movement or whatever, you know, you've got Pittman Robertson, you know, there in the 30s, you've got, you know, coming on the tail end. I mean, we're in the Depression at this point too, you know, so hunting, and I know even from some of my family talking about how important hunting was in securing game to put food on the table or to help out a neighbor during that time, because it was a struggle, and the importance there. So also going through making sure that we've got, you know, the safest, most productive farmland and food in the world, you know, to be able to have that as a piece of it, but also having that conservation piece. When we talk about modern day, so you look at the farm legislation since really the teens, but really started that conservation piece in the 30s through the 50s. And then by the time we hit the 80s, we kind of have the modern day Farm Bill that was passed in 1985. It introduced concepts like the Conservation Reserve Program, where from a point of soil erosion, whether it's air or water erosion, and so, you know, and water quality too, to have cover on the ground, buffers, protect riparian areas, those kind of things, to give the tools to farmers, ranchers, and landowners to put those practices in place that really benefit all of society. You know, clean water, reduce air pollution, dust, all that stuff. So that's kind of where the modern day Farm Bill is. So the 2018 Farm Bill, which is the one that we're operating under now, when we look at it, is $30 billion in the conservation title over 5 years. $30 billion, it's pretty significant. This money all goes to private land farmers, ranchers, landowners, whether you're talking, you know, farm ground, pasture, forestry, wetlands, all of these things that we have available to us underneath that authority under the 2018 Farm Bill. And so you're talking about, you know, tens of billions of dollars that are really impacting hundreds of millions of acres. I'll also say that, you know, you think, well, maybe it's just farm ground, but it also could potentially help out a landowner with a lease on, you know, some funding for cattle on BLM land. Maybe they're going to install some conservation. It helps. There's so many things that can help with. And again, it's going to farmers, ranchers, and landowners to be able to install those conservation programs, because even though we've got a good part of the country that's in public lands, most of it's private. And a lot of our wildlife are produced on private ground. Like you mentioned, maybe hunting in southeastern Ohio. I don't know if you were on public or private, but if you were on public land, being that Ohio is so much private, we are producing a lot of game and wildlife and conservation on private lands.
Yes.
And even out west, people talk about, well, the West is all public, but some of the best land that we have in the West is private. You know, some of the best valleys and the best place that had livestock or maybe cropping. So it's important that we have tools for our landowners and farmers and ranchers to be able to install those. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we're coming up with now. So this Farm Bill basically expires October 1st of 2023. So we're just entering with this Congress to reauthorize it. So it'll either need to be extended or hopefully we get a new whole Farm Bill in place. But again, the other part of it too is it offers money for public access to private lands. So I don't know if you ever hunted in a state where, you know, it's public land or it's private land, but it's the landowner is paid a certain amount of money to open it to public hunting for deer,
right
turkey,
here in Ohio.
Yeah. And we just got that. So that program had been in place since the 2008 Farm Bill. Ohio just was able to take advantage of it. And we are. And through that app on our phone, it's awesome. And
OHLAP. Yep.
Yep. But that program started in states like Kansas and Nebraska and South Dakota, probably 25, maybe close to 30 years ago, where that concept was, where landowners get a little bit more money to open it up and to manage it so that it's open for public use. So that's called the Voluntary Public Access Habitat Improvement Program. I think Ohio got, I can't remember if it was 1.6 or $1.8 million to do that. And hopefully we can expand that. There's some interest in there. A couple landowners signed up. I know I've got some here in near me. I haven't hunted them yet, but I do know that they're there. So that's a perfect example.
I was asked recently, what does the outdoors mean to you? To me, the outdoors is everything. It's like the growth model that consumes the entrepreneur, or the unending drive that pushes the athlete to outperform the competition. It's the greatest teacher of life lessons, whether it be learning to accept that most things are out of your control, or that the trees, the rivers, the mountains move along whether you're there or not. It's the motivator that keeps me accountable to my physical and mental health, because if I don't have the strength and conditioning to do the things that I enjoy outdoors, whether they be hunting, fishing, backpacking, adventure racing, or tackling some long distance adventures, then everything becomes exponentially more difficult. Most importantly, the outdoors allows me to be, to think, to exist in the same plane that the majority of the natural world still exists in. To break the bonds from what we call civilization. The outdoors is freedom, a place where life and death are one and the same. The prime example of what it means to exist. In my mind, there's no separation. The outdoors simply is, as all things should be, perfection in its most chaotic form. The outdoors is you, it's me, it's all of us.
I actually, not long ago, a friend of mine and I had heard about that program, and I said, this is such an awesome opportunity for where I live right now, because by me, I mean, if I walk out my door right now and I drive 15 minutes, I'm at Maumee State Forest, which is a pretty big, decently sized chunk of land. But for the amount of people that live here in Northwest Ohio, it's not that big, especially during deer season. Watch out. It is a madhouse over there. But there's other pockets and stuff. So we found out about this program, and we literally one night he texted me. He's like, hey, fill out this form. We can go hunt this private land for geese. And we woke up, we drove out there. There's little signs that mark the land. Mm-hmm. And, most people would try and keep that a secret, but I like this. If this becomes a successful program, there's more people out there that could take advantage of this, and the more people know, the bigger it can grow, and then we can all have access to private land, because that's one of the hardest things out here. Is like, I'm lucky my father-in-law has some private land that I can hunt, but all the areas surrounding are also private. And it's like, some guy, you can knock on his door and he'll say, no, sorry, I don't like hunters. Maybe they had a bad experience. Or maybe the next guy over, it lives in Montana and he just owns this farm field, and there's no way to get a hold of him really. So stuff like that, where they're paying them to allow people to use their land, is a great incentive. I love that program. I think it's so awesome. And that kind of leads me into my next question, is like, or I guess more of a topic, is like, if someone does not hunt, or they're not interested in hunting, say they're indifferent, they don't really care, but just because of what hunting is, it involves, essentially killing something, and people are a little uncomfortable with that. They also have this view that it's like damaging to wildlife because you're killing it, when it's in the opposite. It's really the opposite, because like you said, a lot of these Pittman Robertson, things like that, fund wildlife conservation to some extent. So how do you kind of work around that? I don't know how much you work with people who don't hunt, because like you're in the world of promoting, wildlife habitat hunting and stuff like that. So how do you tackle that problem? Because that's the hardest conversations I have with people who aren't interested or don't hunt is like, no, actually, this is like a huge service to wildlife because it's doing the opposite of what you think. It's just a weird, confusing thing for people to grasp, I think.
Oh, man. Well, you're getting into a topic. Now we're going to start talking philosophy and all of
that's my favorite. That's
cool. No, that is really interesting. And I know like people with your, what you're doing here with your podcast, and you're seeing that definitely more and more over the years, right? Mm-hmm. And back to the thing that you talked about when you were a kid or you were interested in the conservation or natural resources. And I grew up in this very heavy ag community, and nobody in the conservation space like that. And I was working. So also through college, the best thing I could do is work on farms, and I work construction, right? That was the best money I could make to go do other things. So worked as a welder, went and worked on farms in the summer, did that kind of stuff to put myself through college.
Yep.
But almost every person that I talked to, family or otherwise, thought I was going to go become some environmentalist, like that I wanted to destroy farming or development, because even in the construction side, right? Because we're taking habitat away or those kind of things. So I got hit with that pretty early on, and also growing up with some family members that were almost on the anti-hunting side or didn't understand it, or friends or people you went to college with, or you go to a big university. You're going to run into people from all over the world that didn't understand that. And so, and I know a lot of us are doing it, but you share the game meat with them, or you give them something other than what they would buy at the grocery store, and they get that appreciation for it because they maybe, and I'm talking international, people from other countries that are coming to a big university that really don't get it, especially when they're roommates with a farm hick like me that, I really wanted to bring the dead animals into the dorm room, but probably shouldn't have, that kind of deal. Right. So I think that sharing that story or that kind of, and really having them understand it. But on the conservation side, again, if we go back 150 years ago, or you start talking Teddy Roosevelt, some of the early, then, and you look at what conservation happened early on, a lot of it was from a water quality standpoint too. So Yellowstone was protected because of its natural beauty and water. My original home state of New York, the Adirondack Park,
beautiful,
the 6 million acres where I spent a lot of time in college and high school, and actually took my family there for the first time last summer, was protected because they were doing so much clear cutting. It was impacting the water quality for New York City. The watershed was needed to be protected to protect the water and those kind of things. So I think that when you think big picture like that it is water, but it's also the fact that it's hunting and fishing, and the hunters and anglers that really did it first, right? They were the ones that recognized it. These people that had that as part of it. And that's how they introduced, again, legislation to protect the Adirondack Park or Yellowstone or the national park system, because people that recognize that. And I think just educating people about it, no matter where they're from, and saying, okay, well, clean water. I mean, look at Ohio, look at Lake Erie. We've got algae blooms. Toledo got their drinking water interrupted because of it. The practices that we're doing down here on farmland, restoring wetlands, the H2 Ohio program that Governor DeWine and the Ohio legislature bipartisanly supported that, to put upwards of $400 million to help with water quality that help with that. So I think trying to draw those connections, and I know that it just needs to be part of the discussion, and we need to continue, because less and less of our population is more rural based. They're more urban or suburban. Members of Congress are more urban, and there's still a few farmers and hunters that are members of Congress, but it's less and less all the time because of the change in that demographics. But finding that bipartisan support, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, what chamber you're in, you can draw those connections. And I think that's what we need to, that's what we all try to do. Yeah. As we end up with more, and really promoting what we do to a more diverse audience. And no matter where you're from, or, your background or what you mean, but conservation's available to everybody. There's another story that, our CEO, Howard Vincent of Pheasants Forever, he was at a meeting here. It's been probably in the last 2 years. And he was at a meeting about, I think it was about pollinators or something, or it was a monarch, maybe it was a monarch conference or something. And so they're talking about what we do from a pollinator standpoint for monarch butterflies or whatever, and trying to, again, we're talking farm, private landscapes or public landscapes where we're trying to keep a species like the monarch butterfly from going extinct. I mean, we're really trying to do that. And so this person stood up and said, I am an anti-hunter. I don't let anybody hunt my land. I don't understand it. I don't get it.
Yeah.
But I'm a Pheasants Forever member because they do so much for pollinators and butterflies, right?
Yeah.
So our CEO didn't know where that was headed when he stood up and said, "Hey, what's this invasive, the CEO of this invasive species organization up here talking about things?" But that's how that person wrapped it up. And I think that's where, we can okay, so they don't hunt or they don't allow people to hunt on their land or whatever. But, are they supportive of conservation? Will they pick up that phone call and said, hey, we need farm bill dollars, or we need the Pittman-Robertson Act, or those kind of things. So that's a good way to kind of try to tie it all together. And it does get messy and it gets emotional. And I think that, even in the past, we probably didn't do ourselves any favors by saying, well, it's wildlife management and I'm a biologist and we need to control the herd and all that. But I think we more and more as a community have kind of inserted our own emotion about it. Like, I need to, going back to as a kid, I need to hunt. I provide for my family. It's a great outlet. I love being outdoors, all of those things. But it is that emotional part. You got to decide how you want to engage folks. And some people you're just not going to be able to convince on it.
Yeah. And like one of my good friends, he's a wildlife writer. He's really big into conservation. And the best way I've ever heard it put that I think I try to relate to people is like, so I'm going to screw up the way he said it, but it's essentially along the lines of like, okay, when you're hunting an animal, you're taking the life of that one animal. But when you're taking away habitat and you're building urban sprawl or anything that would destroy habitat, parking lots, whatever, he's like, you're securing that no more of those animals will ever be born in that place. He's like, so that's like one, like people think about the individual as instead of the population, and that's like the best way I've ever heard it put that made sense to me is like you're hunting there's a limit. Well, I don't know what the limit on pheasant is here in Ohio, but you can only take so many per day and so many per year in that aspect, or so you're only allowed to keep so many of these animals. But if you're ruining habitat, there are no animals. And that's the best way I've ever heard it put. So let's step back a little bit. You hunt yourself. You're an upland hunter, which is a fun way to hunt. Deer hunting is a lot of sitting around and waiting, and upland hunting is you're on the go. You got dogs barking and running around. It's just an exciting time. So what's your favorite species to hunt, and like what are some of your favorite places to hunt?
All right. So let's back up a minute on the other philosophical discussion.
Oh yeah, I'm all for philosophical. Let's go.
So I think, back on that emotional piece, or why you hunt, or our very existence has an impact on the world around us. So humans are part of the ecosystem. They have been for millennia, right? We have an impact, and we have the cognitive ability to impact the places around us in our environment. And I'm not gonna call them out right now, but I have a chance to go to a lot of these national conferences. You hear people from all over the world that kind of talk in this space, and I'm not gonna give kudos or whatever to the people, but there's this one gentleman that made a comment at a conference, and it's always stuck with me. And he said, "Flesh eats flesh." Period. Like, our impact in our world, something has got to eat something else, whether it's something grazing on a plant, or, you just look at that again, coming from a biologist background, looking at, the very building blocks of how wildlife, or how we exist. And another quote, our very existence on this planet is about 6 inches in the dirt and the fact that it rains, right?
Yeah.
That's how we exist as a planet. And we've got to protect the water and the soil, because if we don't have that good soil, then we can't have whether it's livestock or food or whatever. So that's really getting into it. But that always kind of stuck with me, that our very existence has an impact, and what we do day to day has an impact. It's whether how engaged you are in that process. Are you going to, eat whatever that has to come from that soil, right? That it keeps us dry. I don't care if you're just, plant-based or meat-based or whatever your diet is. That's what it comes down to. And that's where conservation is so important for soil health and being productive and being able to produce food on that landscape for hundreds or thousands of years, so, and look at those places where humans have lived for a long time, and some of those places, how degraded those soils and places are for food, or even be able to have anything. So anyway, that's way off on a tangent I never thought we'd get on.
No, I love that. Well, let's stay here for a minute. I've had this conversation quite a bit. I mean, I'm just like really curious person. That's like, I just read books about conservation, wildlife. I used to be a vegetarian because in college, that's like what they push. Like, you're a bad person if you eat meat because it's destroying the planet. And then like, I'm also a rebellious person, and I tend to be like, I don't agree with this. This doesn't make sense to me. If it was so bad, then why would everybody be doing it all the time? So I'm thinking, and I still have friends in that like world where they're like heavily vegetarian or vegan or whatever. And at the end of the day, when you really think about it, if you're someone who thinks about the planet and you're someone who thinks about wildlife at all, we're all on the same page. We just have different, it's like all having different religions, but we're all like kind of on the same deal. Like, it's all the same at the end of the day, really, but we're like all arguing about our little pieces of the puzzle that fit together. And I was like, well, I might, if I'm lucky, which is a very, very, very big if, get to take a deer every year. That is something that I'm going to eat every single day for probably 6 to 8 months, my wife and I. Okay. And yes, I still have to buy food at the store because I live in America and it's how we eat. And, so I've gone out of my way to remove, myself out of the system of food production, whatever that is, to the extent of my ability. Whereas like, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, unless you're growing your own food, you're still dealing with farm, whether it's organic, non-organic, whatever. Especially if it's non-organic, you're eating a lot of soy product, which is heavily pesticide laden and stuff like that. And so it's like, are you really doing yourself any justice? And also those farmland, like whether it's intensive farming or whatever, especially intensive, big farm, like there's animals in that habitat that are getting, ground up or whatever by combines and stuff. So it's like, you're not really getting away without killing anything at the end of the day. It's just a different way of going about the same thing. And that's just something I think about a lot, because like we all think we're right. We all think that the way we're doing it is the best way. But it's like, really at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is like, okay, do what you want, but we still need to work together on conservation. That's what's really important for me. From all the different things I've done and seen, I think that that's where we all need to be. Like, you don't have to be a hunter. That's fine. But you can join Pheasants Forever and protect a crap load of habitat. And that's what's important. At the end of the day, the habitat is what's important for these animals to thrive, because everybody loves animals. They're cool. Just to watch wildlife is awesome. So, right. I went on a tangent myself there.
Yeah, not the way I thought the conversation was going today. And I probably should qualify that some of this may not be the official position of Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. It might be, but we do talk, and we do have to operate in these things. And I think, even talking the broad coalitions that we have, we do have employees that are precision ag specialists that are working, including a couple here in Ohio, that are working on that productivity sustainability side of things. So how do we get clean water, work on your soil, and again, those basic building blocks. So, and I would say that's the other thing that we've always prided ourselves with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever and being part of these communities is a lot of people are farmers or in the ag business or whatever, and they love their farming operation and they love their, producing crops and cattle and livestock, but they also love hunting. And that's part of their tradition or their heritage to have both. And I've had the pleasure of being at some of these national conferences in the ag space to talk about these things where we're sitting there with our counterparts, with other organizations and talking about these exact same things. But, I know that we just have to keep that dialogue up and find out how to message around that and work together and, make good things happen from that side. And that really biodiversity and wildlife is part of that. When we're talking about, like I mentioned before, a little bit, collapses in pollinator or butterfly, monarch butterfly. You've got the cardinal blue butterfly up there in Toledo, and part of the, the work that we're trying to do there. But we're looking at these species that we really, as being stewards of the planet, we need to make sure that those species stay here with us.
Yeah. And, a lot of things, especially with farming, people are so up in arms about it, which I understand. And it would be so hypocritical for me as someone who is like very, very much into conservation and environmental issues to say that I disagree with farming in any way, shape, or form, because literally none of us exist on this planet with 8 billion people on it or around that number without farming. It's just like an impossibility to sustain that many people. It's just like how the goal at the end of the day, in my mind, is like, how can we just make it better? Like, there is a way to do it. We just, like, humans are very good at figuring this stuff out. That's all we do. That's like how we have jobs, is we figure stuff. We get paid to figure stuff out so we can go home and eat. That's like what we do as humans. So it's like, it would be very hypocritical for anyone to say that farming is something that they're against. It's like, well, then you would be dead. Then you would have to hunt, which you are against. So how do you make this justified at the end of the day? So yeah, that was a very cool topic. But back to that question, what do you like to hunt? What's your personal favorites and where do you like to go?
Sure. So again, going back to the farm in Western New York, it was pheasants, rabbits, squirrel, goose hunting. The goose hunting was always pretty good on our farm. Again, I had the friends that had the dogs and the decoys and all that. So that's kind of what I did. I'd never deer hunted that much, a few times. And, to be honest with you, I took my first deer harvest 5 years ago here in Wyandotte County because I love the upland hunt so much that, dogs, wing shooting. I like waterfowl hunting too. So turkey, waterfowl, I like wing shooting. I was the same way where I just could not sit in a deer stand. Like I can't sit. I have a hard time sitting still. I'd rather go hunt all day and walk 10, 15 miles, and even if I don't get a bird, I want to go walk with my dogs and run behind them. I'd go out west quite a bit, just about every year for the last 20 years. I've had a chance to hunt a lot of the Midwestern states. So that was my deal. But so I did have an opportunity on my wife's family farm here in Wyandotte where I started to say, you know what, my kids are getting older. My boys are, he'll be 10 and soon to be 12 here. And I'm like, man, I just never deer hunted, but it's obviously a resource here. Mm-hmm. And it's an easy resource. You can hunt public, private ground and had some opportunities there. So I did that. So I did, and I am making the intent to try to even do some big game hunting out west. So, my most recent pursuit was try to draw an eastern Montana antelope tag and go upland hunt, do a double, upland hunt and antelope. So I started to put in points out west. Obviously in this space, I've got a lot of friends and colleagues throughout the country. I can find connections. I can find that. It's just making time, having kind of a young family and not being able to travel a ton the last 10 years, but that's going to change. So, but I love wing shooting. I love dog work, upland hunting, mixed bag. If I can get out in the field and chase multiple upland species or, go sit in a duck blind in North Dakota in the morning and go chase sharptails and roosters in the afternoon. Those are my ideal days. One of the cool things I had this year was the last day of deer gun season. I shot a doe, and then Monday morning I took the dog because I'm trying to hunt this CRP field on the land. I didn't want to mess up my deer hunting, so that's my dilemma because I used to like the duck hunt because I got a little wetland there too. It's like, man, I just got to stay out of here and deer hunt, and then as soon as deer's done, then I can go chase pheasants and waterfowl. Yeah. So anyway, I got that doe on Sunday morning, and then on Monday morning I took the dog for a spin and got a rooster. So I've got a picture that I have, with the deer and the rooster. So I just love that mixed bag side of things. But that's the deal. But I love chasing the dogs or having dogs with me to do the work. So
working under dogs is one of the coolest things ever. And I always, I didn't understand it until I did it. I was like, that's just like a lot of work to train a dog for that, to do that. And then I went with somebody last year now, And I was just like, this is one of the most amazing things ever, just to see the dogs excited. So what kind of dogs do you have? I mean, there's a wide variety of species people hunt with, but what do you have right now?
So I've got a 5-year-old wire hair pointing Griffon, kind of in the wire hair category, because I like that versatility of being able to waterfowl hunt and upland hunt. I wanted that versatility. I also joined the North American Versatile Hunting Dog Association too, to be able to train. So work locally with a club to work on that side of things. So that's kind of what I've done. I had a short hair before that. I'm on a list right now for another German short hair pointer that I'm thinking about getting for my 12-year-old son, and get him kind of on the junior training in the NAVDA side. And so that's one of the things that I'm working on with the North American Versatile Hunting Dog Association. So yeah, that's kind of what I like. So
yeah. Bird hunting is awesome. I love it so much.
Mm-hmm. And even though we don't have maybe the wild pheasants, I've also had really good luck at like woodcock hunting, the migratory side of things. It can be pretty good here in Northwest Ohio or Central Ohio on public lands. Like, I don't think I've shot one woodcock on private. Most of the time I'm hitting public lands because we've got some opportunities, and it's usually, it's getting maybe a little bit more popular, but it can be a lot of fun, especially when you hit the flight right, as they're moving out of Michigan. Cause I have grouse and woodcock hunted in Michigan too, but, it can be a lot of fun. So.
Yeah. I didn't even realize that you could hunt woodcock down here until I was duck hunting. And I was at McGee Marsh, or Metzger's Marsh. It was McGee Marsh. They have those blinds that are, permanently installed out there. And we got a lottery to get in on one with some friends. And we were, the water was like maybe 10, 15 inches deep. So we were pulling the boat through mud essentially. And I just scared a woodcock out, and I was like, wait. This is wild. I could woodcock hunt here. So that's just something I have to look forward to. And, I have, a lot of people go all over the country to hunt. I do as well. I love hunting and fishing and all that stuff. But it's like, I often overlook the opportunities I have right here in my backyard. And that's just something that I'm trying to embrace more, is like, there's so much opportunity here in Ohio. I don't know why people hate Ohio so much. I mean, we have so much like hunting and fishing opportunities. We literally have Lake Erie. Like, what else can you ask for?
There, like you said, there are tremendous opportunities on the public land side of things. And now, like I said, with the hopefully expand with opening more areas, but we do have a lot of hunters, and we don't maybe have as much public land available. But man, I told the story, I've told it several times, but my favorite time to upland hunt is during a Buckeye game, because I usually go out there and there's nobody on public land. Especially, and I'm not gonna, I'm serious. I seriously, because again, not from here. I married a Buckeye. I get it.
Yeah.
But if I want to be behind bird dogs or watch a football game, man, I'm going to leave at halftime, or maybe come back or go out. And I tell you, you can have a lot of space to yourself out there. So
that's a great point. You might have just given away like a secret that
but the more the merrier, and again, so, and I do it. And obviously during some times of the year it can be busy, but middle of the week, or, trying to grab a couple hours after work in the middle of the week, you can have a lot of space. And like you said, with this app now and some of the more controlled stuff where you can have a better experience, and the Ohio Division of Wildlife has done a great job. They have a great partnership, and they really are trying to do everything that we can and bring more of those dollars into the state. So that's the thing. The more dollars that we can capture, really we're talking tens of millions of dollars in the conservation space through many different forms of funding, that we can make better habitat too. Because the other thing is, you don't want to go try to hunt some place where the habitat isn't as good, but it takes a lot of work to make habitat as productive as possible. And, we enjoy working with the division and, USDA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and all the agencies, state and federal agencies and other partners to make that happen. So. Yeah,
and I think there's one topic we didn't touch on that we discussed, which I don't want to keep you all day. I know I could easily keep you here all day if I had the time. So, with this congressional, like, I know we delayed this podcast to talk about like how like you're working with this congressional turnover and stuff, and how that's affecting stuff. Like, so how does that affect wildlife when things are turning over and there's getting new people, and maybe new people coming in, leaving, new people going, whatever? How does that affect wildlife policy?
Sure. Yeah. So we were going to try to record this in December. And the reason why we put it on hold is at that time we had the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is something that we've been working on for 7-8 years now. So the last couple Congresses. We thought maybe we were trying to get it done in that omnibus package, the last thing that passed before Congress, basically the last Congress ended, and we end up with a new Congress. And that was part of the budget process and all that. So we didn't get it done. So now we're into the next Congress, try to get Recovering America's Wildlife Act. If passed, that would add another $1.4 billion every year to the state wildlife agencies. In Ohio, that would mean another $20 to $22 million to coming into the state. And then the other thing that we were working on, part of our national priority, is the Grasslands Act. And the National Grasslands Act that we introduced about 2 years ago, we did get it introduced on the Senate side. It's going to be another top priority for us. One of the things that did make it in that I don't think we talked about was some of the chronic wasting disease funding. Okay. That's another crazy story. Now, we're not as engaged on there. It's part of the wildlife community. It's not something that Pheasants Forever was pushing for. But it is important to the wildlife community because what CWD has done is it takes resources away from state wildlife agencies to try to combat it the best that they can. Yeah. So it takes resources away from getting habitat done, or it takes staff away to focus on that. Personally, that impacted me because that first CWD buck was found just a couple miles from my family's land here in Wyandotte County. Never would have expected it to show up where it did. It's obviously impacted our hunting. It's impacted the resources that the division and other agencies had to do to try to address it. So that's a good win. So that's, I just lost a number, 60 or $70 million nationwide that'll go to states to help try to spread the disease of CWD. Of course, that can have a major impact on our ability to have healthy, deer and ungulate population. Ungulates. So, that's just an example. So that was a good thing that so we got in there. There were several members in Ohio that helped support that. But those are the kind of things that we were waiting on to see what would happen. We didn't know who, leadership was going to be yet. We didn't have a speaker of the House. That was kind of a historic, just crazy thing that happened there. But hey, we got a speaker. There's you've got a chairman of, say, the House Ag Committee now. You've got all this leadership in play that will, start to get to work here in Congress. The Senate doesn't come in until the end of January. The House is already ramping up. There's hearings that are happening here on that. So that's what will start happening, is that those committees will get together, bills will be introduced, again, good and bad ones. And I would just say stay tuned and follow your favorite conservation organization, and you'll see some of these things come up and absolutely engage. We need you to pick up the phone and send that email and send that letter to get things the direction we need them to.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you for coming on this podcast. It's been very informative for me, and I hope my listeners get a lot out of this. Where can people learn more about Pheasants Forever if they're interested in joining? I always encourage people at the end of the episodes to join a conservation organization, get a little more involved than you normally would, push yourself out of that comfort zone of just day in, day out, thinking about it. So where can people learn more about Pheasants Forever? And we'll wrap her up.
Sure. So, nationwide, you can find us at pheasantsforever.org or quailforever.org. As I mentioned, we've got our national convention coming up in Minneapolis. We're expecting over 30,000 people to show up that weekend. If you have any inkling to go and see awesome upland stuff, bird dogs, seminars, all that stuff, you're welcome to show up there. I know we talked about Ohio or Michigan or maybe some of the other states. Obviously we've got social media pages in each of those states. Take a look at those. You can follow me on Twitter at Jim Inglis _PF. You can find me there. And as well, again, that's where a lot of our policy stuff, but you'll see that policy stuff come in. And since we talked a lot about policy today, I do have there is a page within Pheasants Forever. If you look under conservation advocacy, we try to do an update there. And my colleagues, from around the country try to do like a video update, 15, 20 minutes every month or so. You'll find out the latest and greatest information there. But when it comes, we try to hit social media just absolutely as quickly as possible when things are there. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that, or it is archived on our policy page. So the other thing I need to extend to you is you said you haven't been pheasant hunting before yet. So we need to work on that and get you out to like a new Learn to Pheasant Hunt event or something.
Yeah.
We'll get you out there and do that for sure. So.
All right. Well, Jim, thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you do. And, you're helping save a lot of wildlife habitat, one-man machine. I know there's a lot of teamwork that goes to that stuff, but I mean, you're really leading the charge out here, especially it's great to have people from Ohio that work on this national level protecting wildlife. It makes me feel more stoked to live here. So thank you so much. And keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for highlighting this stuff. And we can always, hop on again if you've got other topics you want to talk about.
Absolutely.